Now on Overnights,
I believe in reason and common sense.
Leith Van Onselen from Macro Business with the Treasury of Common Sense.
Common sense never goes out of style.
Hello, Leith. How are you this morning?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I saw this story and I thought immediately, I bet you've got a comment about this with Labor lighting the match under the house prices. Where are you at with it?
Yeah, that's right, mate. This is, par for the course in Australia, unfortunately. So, according to Cotality, so they used to be known as CoreLogic. They're basically one of the major housing data providers in Australia. They valued Australia's housing at an average of 1,020,000. So that's 1,020,000 for every house, apartment, bed sit across the nation. It's an incredibly, expensive, extraordinary figure when you think about over $1 million just to buy an average home in Australia.
Yeah. And
it's made Australia basically one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. And, Australia's housing stock is valued at about 400,000 per capita in March this year. And that's, in real terms, that's once you adjust for inflation, it's more than tripled in value in the last 30 years. So we've had this, absolutely ginormous 30-year housing boom in the nation that has, obviously driven the average home value over $1 million. And notionally, at least, it's made Australians some of the wealthiest people on earth. So the latest UBS Global Wealth Report came out last month, and it ranked Australians' households as being the second wealthiest in the world in terms of median wealth. And that was just behind Luxembourg. But unlike other nations, Phil, Australians hold most of the wealth in their overpriced homes rather than financial assets. So, other nations that were in these rankings tend to hold more wealth in shares, in cash, that sort of thing. Australians are wealthy because we've got super expensive houses. Right? And because of that, I'd argue that, most of our wealth is actually fake. It's imaginary.
Yeah, right.
Because it's not, it's not liquid, right? So whether or not your home's worth $500,000, $2 million, $5 million, whatever, it's just really somewhere to live. And you can't eat your house, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this massive amount of, capital in the nation, which has just poured into the housing market over the last 30 years, is actually one of the things that's helping to wreck the nation's productivity. It's certainly not the only thing, but Australia's banks have become massively focused on mortgage lending at the expense of lending to businesses. So, just by way of comparison, in 1990, roughly 2/3 of bank lending was to businesses, whereas if he's, 35 years later, in 2025, the ratio is completely flipped, and now 2/3 of bank lending is for housing and barely 1/3 of businesses. And in Australia, 5 of the 10 most valuable companies on the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX, are banks. So you got, the Big Four and Macquarie Bank. And whereas if you compare that to America, which is, the most productive economy in the advanced world at the moment, America's share market is dominated by, tech companies, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, things like that. And productivity is booming in the US, whereas in Australia it's completely stagnant. Now, I'm not saying it's all because of the housing problem, but, it's part of it. And it's kind of perverse that despite being amongst the wealthiest households in the world, Australians struggling so much financially. So they're obviously buckling under the weight of mortgage payments, rent payments. According to Cotality, formerly CoreLogic, both mortgage payments and rent payments were sucking up a record share of our incomes at the end of 2024. And, given that housing affordability is at such a dire state, young people can't afford to buy homes, they're struggling to rent, it's pretty rich to sort of think that, young people obviously need their parents to help them out to try and buy a home. It's kind of a bit perverse to think that we've got the second wealthiest households. And really, Australians would be wealthier if the average home was worth 500,000 instead of over $1 million. And we had, household debt to income was 90% instead of 180%, which it is at the moment. And, just by way of counterpoint, in 1991, Australia's home ownership rate was 5% higher than it is today. Homes cost 3 times incomes versus 8 times incomes today. And household debt was 70% of income versus 180% of income today. And banks, as I said before, lent 2/3 of businesses, only 1/4 of mortgages. So they mostly lent to businesses. And, based on that, objectively, households are far better off in 1991 than they are today, yet we're now the second most richest households in the world, apparently.
Right.
And also, I'd argue the Australian economy was far more diversified in 1991 than it is today. We're basically just a houses and holes economy now. So this is a long way to get around to the fact that Australia's expensive housing is basically a gross misallocation of capital. It's wrecking our productivity, or it's harming our productivity. It's obviously, harming, like, housing affordability is terrible in this country. And really the last thing you want to do when you have homes that are valued at $1,020,000 on average is to pour more petrol on the housing bonfire. And unfortunately, that's exactly what the Albanese government has done. So during the election campaign, they announced that they were going to allow all first home buyers, effectively, to purchase a home with only a 5% deposit. And the taxpayer, i.e. the government, would basically guarantee 15% of all borrowers' loans. Now, this week, the government announced that policy is going to be brought forward to the 1st of October. So it's going to come in very shortly. And the Australian Treasury predicts that this policy, that 70,000 homes will be purchased by first home buyers in the first year of the scheme. And obviously, if you're going to bring in all these extra people who can borrow with a 5% deposit, and you're going to basically guarantee 15% of homes, you're going to increase demand for housing, and you're going to put upward pressure on prices. We've seen the past 25 years, when the government's done first home buyer grants, done, any kind of subsidies, etc., under the name of affordability, every time that's happened, it's basically led to bigger mortgages and higher home prices. So these policies always get capitalised into higher home prices, and they're ultimately self-defeating from an affordability perspective. In the end, you just end up with more expensive housing than you would have had otherwise, and people carrying more debt than they would have had otherwise. And in this case, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for 15% of these mortgages, which means that if there ever is a housing crash in the future, I'm not saying there will be one, but if there is, taxpayers will be on the hook, and then the government will be incentivised to then fire hose more taxpayer money at the housing market to blow house prices even higher to avoid having to take those losses. So modelling that was released by Lateral Economics this week concluded that this 5% deposit scheme alone could increase house prices by between 3.5% and 6.6% nationally within the first year. So that's across all homes. And for the properties that first home buyers are most likely to buy, so those are sort of your slightly more affordable properties because they tend to not be able to buy the expensive ones. This modelling suggested that prices could rise by just under 10% within 12 months as a result of this policy. So, again, when you've got the average home in Australia is valued at $1,020,000, the last thing the market needs is for the federal government to be pouring more policy stimulus on the housing bonfire and making homes even more expensive, which is going to be the ultimate result. And then, having people taking on even more household debt or even more mortgage debt to be able to buy these homes with lower deposits. Because ultimately, you're just going to end up with more expensive housing. This is exactly what's happened for the last 25 years with all these sorts of policies. It's never made housing more expensive. It's never boosted housing supply. It just ends up pushing up prices, pushing up debt. It means the banking system becomes more warped, just lending to mortgages rather than to businesses. Ultimately, it distorts the economy, which is what we've had. And ultimately, it's going to be, destructive from a productivity perspective. And if the Albanese government genuinely wanted to improve housing affordability, it should have taken the pressure off rents and house prices by lowering immigration, right? So, Alan Kohler wrote from the ABC, wrote earlier in the week that the number of net overseas migrants that's landed since the Albanese government was elected, since the pandemic, was around 800,000 more than the Australian Treasury projected in its budget. So we've got 800,000 more people have come in that require housing, that require rental housing, which is one of the reasons why rents have gone up on average by about $10,000 the median rent is $10,000 roughly, or just over $10,000 more across the country than it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've got, hundreds of thousands of extra people have come in, more than the government ever expected. who need rental properties, and that's also putting upward pressure on prices. So if the government really want to take the pressure off the housing market, both rents and prices, and wanted to make housing more affordable, it should cut immigration. And it should cut it quite hard, because demand through immigration has run well ahead of supply for years, and it's going to continue to run ahead of supply. And the federal government's own advisory council, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, forecasts that over the next 5 years, Australia's housing shortage is going to worsen by 79,000 homes, because the number of people coming in through immigration is going to exceed the number of homes that will be built. Yet the same analysis in their sensitivity analysis said if we just reduce population growth by 15%, so we still grow quite strongly, but we just reduce population growth by 15%, instead of having a 79,000 shortage of homes, we'd have a 40,000 surplus. So that tells you that the solution here is to lower the demand by lowering immigration and lowering this population pressure. It takes the pressure off rents, takes the pressure off prices. That's what they should do. Unfortunately, Phil, the Albanese government's taken the opposite approach. They've actually expanded the intake for international students by another 25,000, and they've also watered down English language standards for migrants. And what that means is we're more likely to get higher migration going forward, not less. And as a result, the population demand is going to continue to run ahead of supply, which means that we're just going to have this worsening overall affordability, this structural housing shortage. So unfortunately, this 5% deposit scheme is just a policy band-aid. It's going to make the situation worse when the solution is staring the government in the face. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, which is the federal government's own advisory council, says in black and white that Australia cannot build enough homes for the number of people that are coming through migration. And the solution, according to its own sensitivity analysis, is to cut immigration. Because if you do that, you'll actually create a surplus of homes, and you'll take the pressure off rents, and you'll lower prices, other things equal. So it's just more of the same, unfortunately, Phil. We've seen this stuff for 25 years. Poor policy from federal government. Just keep pouring more fuel on the housing bonfire, and instead of letting prices drift lower and become more affordable, or instead of allowing rents to become more affordable, they just keep making both more expensive and actually making the housing affordability situation even worse in Australia.
Always good common sense, my friend. Where can people find more details? You've got a website, haven't you?
We do. It's macrobusiness.com.au. I write about these issues every day.
With